The Outlaw Josey Wales is one of the best Clint Eastwood westerns ever made, so let's take a look at 20 things you didn't know about the movie, including the controversial origin of its story, why the original director was fired after just 10 days, and what became of the sequel that you've probably never even heard of. Now, the origin of the movie can be traced back to a book called The Rebel Outlaw Josey Wales, a privately printed novel that was submitted to Clint Eastwood's production company, Malpaso Productions, with the hope that it might get picked up and adapted into a film. But the chances of this were very slim, as the office was always flooded with submissions, and any unsolicited manuscripts were typically sent back unread. But on this occasion, producer Robert Daly was intrigued by the unusual cover letter that was included with the novel, which referred to Clint Eastwood's kind eyes, and humbly requested his consideration. So the producer took the book home to read, and was absolutely blown away by its quality, feeling that the lead role was a perfect fit for Clint Eastwood. So he immediately flew the novel out to him, and Eastwood loved it, even going as far as to personally contribute funds to secure the screen rights. So once they'd obtained the rights to the novel, producer Robert Daly reached out to its unknown author, a Cherokee man called Forrest Carter, who was rewarded a lucrative republication of his book by a mainstream publisher, under the new title of Gone to Texas. But when Daly finally met the author face to face, he was shocked by his behaviour, believing him to be a sociopath, after he drunkenly urinated in a public bar and later professed his love to a woman at knife point. Despite this, Carter was able to publish a second book called The Education of Little Tree, which became an award-winning bestseller, marketed as a memoir of his childhood in the Appalachian Mountains, where he was raised by his Cherokee grandparents. However, this turned out to be just as fictional as Josey Wales, as it was later discovered that Forrest Carter was in fact Asa Earl, a former KKK leader and segregationist speechwriter for the American politician George Wallace, a shocking discovery that probably never would have been made if not for the overwhelming success of The Outlaw Josey Wales. Now, although the movie was based on a book, it was transformed into a screenplay by Sonia Chernis, as well as its director Philip Kaufman, who was a big fan of the original novel. So he wanted to keep the script as close to the source material as possible, maintaining its depiction of Josey Wales as a straight-talking, tobacco-spitting gunslinger. Equally, side characters from the book such as Lone Waite, Laura Lee, Little Moonlight, and Grandma Sarah all ended up featuring heavily in the movie. But he did make some key changes. For instance, the Union soldiers chasing Josey at the start of the film essentially drop out of the story halfway through the novel. So in the film, he decided to keep them around as an ongoing threat, to facilitate the action-packed shootout at the end of the movie. Kaufman also did his best to strip the screenplay of most of its political ideology, but did retain much of the pro-South, anti-North sentiment that originated in the novel. But ultimately, the screenplay juggled all of these elements surprisingly well, resonating across the political spectrum, while also being praised for its refreshingly nuanced and respectful portrayal of Native Americans. So when it came to who should direct the movie, Clint Eastwood decided to go with Philip Kaufman, very much impressed by his underrated 1972 western, The Great Northfield Minnesota Raid. However, as soon as production began, Clint Eastwood realized that he might have made a mistake, as Kaufman proved to be a very particular, meticulous filmmaker, which was practically the opposite to Eastwood, who was big on efficiency and working things out through trial and error. It also didn't help that during the first scene that they shot, where Laura Lee is attacked in the desert, Eastwood apparently felt as if Kaufman lost control of the scene, and didn't agree with the way that actress Sandra Locke had been treated during its filming. But the moment that really seemed to break their working relationship was when it came time to shoot the scene in which Josey rides over the dunes against the sun. This was because Kaufman had already scouted the perfect hill to shoot the scene on, and had even left a bottle there as a marker to find it later on. But due to the shifting sands, it eventually became buried and impossible to find, yet Kaufman apparently refused to shoot the scene anywhere else, and was adamant about finding the exact hill that he had originally spotted. As a result, Eastwood suggested that the director take a car out to go search for it. And the moment that he left, the actor immediately took charge, quickly filming the scene in question while they still had light. But when Kaufman eventually returned, he was furious, feeling as if his authority as a director had now been fatally compromised. Another issue that came between the pair was the casting of actress Sondra Locke as Laura Lee, a casting that Clint Eastwood really pushed for, against the wishes of the director, who couldn't understand why a 32-year-old woman was being cast for a 22-year-old character. But the irony was that when filming started, there were rumors that Kaufman actually developed an infatuation for Locke, right around the same time as Clint Eastwood, who went on to have a 13-year relationship with the actress, while starring alongside each other in numerous movies. So it eventually became clear that Philip Kaufman just wasn't the right fit for Clint Eastwood, who arranged a private meeting with the director and fired him after just 10 days of shooting. And the decision apparently didn't go down well on set, with several members of the cast and crew holding it against Eastwood, feeling as if he took a lot of credit for Kaufman's work, such as his location and costume decisions, as well as the casting of Chief Dan George. Now, unbeknownst to Clint Eastwood, his firing of Philip Kaufman ended up having much bigger ramifications beyond the film itself, because news of the sacking was met with outrage from the Directors Guild of America, given that Kaufman had already put a lot of work into the film, including completing all of its pre-production. In fact, the backlash was so bad that when Warner Brothers and Clint Eastwood refused to reinstate Kaufman, they were reportedly fined $60,000. And to stop the same thing from happening again in the future, the Guild decided to pass a new rule known as the Eastwood Rule, which prevents an actor or producer from firing the director in order to take the position for themselves. So in a whirlwind of controversy, Clint Eastwood officially became the director of the Outlaw Josey Wales moving forward, making it just the second Western that he'd ever directed. So when it came to casting, Clint Eastwood made a point of hiring actors that he'd already worked with before, and knew he could trust. For instance, John Vernon, who played Fletcher, also played the mayor in Dirty Harry. Likewise, John Quaid, who plays the outlaw leader, famously appeared in High Plains Drifter as one of the townspeople. And Sheb Wooley had already starred alongside Eastwood in multiple episodes of Rawhide. Also, another noteworthy casting is Matt Clark as a bartender, who later played a similar role in Back to the Future 3, in which he says he only serves whiskey to Marty, which some believe is a subtle callback to when he tells Josie that he's run out of whiskey. Now, perhaps one of the most memorable castings in the movie was that of Chief Dan George, who totally stole the show as the character of Lone Waite. And the reason that he was hired was all because of his memorable performance in Little Big Man, for which he earned a supporting actor nomination at the Academy Awards. However, when filming started on the Outlaw Josey Wales, the 76-year-old actor was clearly having trouble memorizing his lines, so much so that Clint Eastwood got into the habit of ruining takes by mouthing the actor's lines to try and help him. So in the end, Eastwood told the actor to just forget his lines, and instead perform his interpretations of them, which ended up sounding far more authentic and compelling than what was written in the script. So over the course of the shoot, Eastwood forged a genuine admiration for the actor, even getting emotional when it came time to shoot their final scene together. Now, a big reason why the Outlaw Josey Wales looked so visually impressive was because Clint Eastwood hired his most trusted cinematographer, Bruce Surtees, who previously shot High Plains Drifter. So he knew exactly how to get the most out of the film's various shooting locations. They included Arizona, Utah, and California. They also made a point of shooting in the fall, when there are a lot more natural shadows, which ended up being a big part of the visual identity of the movie. Another really important aspect of the film was its music. So Clint Eastwood hired composer Jerry Fielding, who already had a history working on westerns, such as The Wild Bunch and Chato's Land. And for the Outlaw Josey Wales, he delivered a memorable yet understated score that really added to the film, earning him an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Score. So although Clint Eastwood hadn't originally planned on directing the movie, at this stage in his career he'd already had a lot of experience in how to do so, having previously worked under many famous directors. But perhaps none proved as influential on this film as Sergio Leone, with the character of Josey Wales feeling very much like the man with no name. The movie also shared a lot of visual DNA with the Dollars trilogy, including its panoramic landscapes, expressive close-ups, and distinctive quick cuts. In fact, in an interview, Clint Eastwood went as far as to directly compare the movie to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, except for one major difference, saying, "Josey Wales is a hero, and you see how he gets to where he is, rather than just having a mysterious hero appear on the plains and become involved with other people's plight." So as well made as the Outlaw Josey Wales was, it isn't without its mistakes. For instance, during the climax of the movie, despite only 15 soldiers crossing the creek to confront Josey, he and his allies somehow kill well over 20 men in the gunfight that follows. Also, at the start of the movie, when Josey starts using the Gatling gun, despite the weapon only being able to hold between 20 to 50 rounds, Josey fires way more, killing numerous soldiers, while their horses stand unconcerned in the line of fire behind them. So following the high-profile firing of Philip Kaufman, it was very clear who was in charge on set, with Clint Eastwood now serving as the movie's lead actor, producer, and director. And although Warner Brothers were generally very pleased with how the movie was shaping up, they did have some notes after being shown a screening of the finished film, with perhaps the biggest being that they would like it to be shortened by half an hour. But when the studio sent an executive to give this feedback to Eastwood, the director told him that he would have to do it himself, as he was busy. And when the executive asked where Eastwood would be, he replied, "I'll be across the street at Paramount cutting a new deal." So it seemed the studio got the message loud and clear, as the film was left uncut, and ended up being 2 hours and 15 minutes long. So around the time that the Outlaw Josey Wales released, westerns had dramatically declined in popularity, especially ones centered around the Civil War, so there was a real skepticism in Hollywood about the movie. However, the Outlaw Josey Wales was a big commercial hit, earning $31.8 million against a $3.7 million budget, making it one of Clint Eastwood's most profitable films at the time. So a big reason why The Outlaw Josey Wales was such a success was because it was universally embraced by audiences and critics alike. For instance, Phil Hardy of Time Out said, "It demonstrated Eastwood's ability to recreate his first starring role as the mythic man with no name of the Italian westerns, and to subtly undercut it through comedy and mockery." Likewise, Tony Sloman of the Radio Times said, "Clint Eastwood seized the directorial reins from Phil Kaufman and fashioned this tough, sprawling post-Civil War Western epic into something approaching a personal testament." Now, considering its overwhelmingly positive reception, it's probably no surprise that The Outlaw Josey Wales has left behind a considerable legacy. For instance, the famous TV host Johnny Carson called it the greatest western of all time. Likewise, the legendary director Orson Welles admitted to seeing it 4 times, claiming it belongs with the great westerns of John Ford and Howard Hawks. Since then, the movie was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry, and is still widely considered one of the greatest westerns ever made. So given how popular The Outlaw Josey Wales proved to be, Clint Eastwood is often asked about the meaning of the movie. So in an interview in 2011, he finally revealed that he intended the movie to be an anti-war film, saying, "As for Josey Wales, I saw the parallels to the modern day at the time. Everybody gets tired of it, but it never ends. A war is a horrible thing, but it's also a unifier of countries. Man becomes his most creative during war. Look at the amount of weaponry that was made in 4 short years of World War II, and just the urgency and the camaraderie and the unifying. But that's kind of a sad statement on mankind, if that's what it takes." So shortly after the rebel Outlaw Josey Wales was republished, its author actually released a follow-up novel called The Vengeance Trail of Josey Wales. Set shortly after the events of the first movie, the book picks up with Josey Wales living quietly with his now wife Laura Lee and their baby son, until news reaches him that a close friend of his has been murdered and captured by a Mexican emperor. So Josey decides to come out of hiding to travel to Mexico and confront a corrupt lawman in order to break his surviving friend out of jail. And Clint Eastwood actually intended to adapt this novel into a sequel to The Outlaw Josey Wales. However, the plans ultimately fell through. So instead, the book was adapted into the 1986 film The Return of Josey Wales, directed by Michael Parks, who also played Josey. And upon its release, the film received universally negative reviews, with critics across the board panning it as a cheap, uninspired cash grab, hence why nowadays it's all but forgotten. So despite its controversial origin and turbulent production, nowadays Clint Eastwood considers The Outlaw Josey Wales one of the best films of his career, and one of the most satisfying movies he's ever made. It also proved that he was no longer an up-and-coming, unproven actor-turned-director, and was more than capable of directing himself in movies moving forward, especially when it came to westerns. But even so, he decided to wait 9 years before making another western with 1985's Pale Rider, which proved to be just as well made and well received as The Outlaw Josey Wales. But let me know below, do you agree with Clint Eastwood that this western was probably the best one he ever made? Also, if you made it this far, it would be much appreciated if you could leave the video a like to help it reach others, and you might also want to check out this video right here.